Hey everyone, we're back with another big Capes and Lunatics episode. And talking about a really big one this time. We're going to talk about Superman Red Sun, the animated movie. Uh, and it's really big because we have one of the co-writers, Mr. J.M. Dematteis. You probably know him from a ton of Marvel and DC, and now he has his own things going on. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. How are you doing, Mr. Dematteis?
I am doing great. How are you guys doing? All things considered.
Yeah.
Locked down tight, but still breathing.
Yeah. That's good that you can say that. That's a good thing,
Oh yeah.
especially the
Yes.
breathing part.
All right.
Yes.
So, yeah, like I said, I watched the movie last night. I really enjoyed it. I did. Oh, Lilith, you there?
Yeah.
All right. All right. We just started. So, yeah, no, my big question. I've been wanting to ask this for a while since we set this up. With adapting a already existing work into like a animated movie, do you find it
Hmm.
easier or harder, or is it like a combination of the two? Because it's like the roadmap is already there, but it's like you want to put your own, you have to make it original. You have to, your own original spin on it. You have to adapt it to a different medium.
Yeah, it's really all those things. The good news is obviously you're not starting from nothing.
Yes.
So, and in this case, we're starting from like a really great story. The great thing about the comic is that it's one of those stories where you give them one line, Soviet Superman, and everyone goes, "Oh, they're instantly reacting." So and the graphic novel is just filled with incidents and ideas and creativity. It's so stuffed with imagination. Like every page, there's incredible stuff going on in that story. Um, so the blessing is that you're not starting with a blank page. The curse is you have to take that giant stuffed story and turn it into a very streamlined 80 or 85-minute movie. I explained it to somebody as if you've got a giant redwood tree, and you got to take that redwood tree and you have to carve it down into a 6-foot statue of Superman. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to get carved away. And as you begin to carve at it, you realize that necessarily what works within the context of a graphic novel won't necessarily work within the context of an animated movie. No adaptation is ever going to be literal. It just doesn't work. If you want it to be literal, then you need a motion comic or an audiobook or something. Um, so I think what a good adaptation does, and I've certainly seen it as an audience when I see something adapted based on a book that I've loved, is that you capture the spirit of the thing. The letter of the thing is important up to a point, but it's really the spirit of the thing. So that even if you twist it and bend it and change it, you know that you're getting the essence of what the creator of the original work was trying to communicate. And then you hope that you add to it. Because, if people are going to, if they're a fan of the comic and then they're going to go see the movie, you want them to get something else out of it, not just a literal translation, or else stay home and read the comic. So it's moving around on screen. You want it to have its own life and its own personality. And I think and I hope that that's what we did with this. I think we honored the source material, but we also made something that was very much its own at the same time. And hopefully, which is what I see sometimes with adaptations, that between the source material and the adaptation, they kind of come together to create almost a third entity. Do you know what I mean? You put them
Hmm.
together in your brain and they kind of blend. I've seen that with certain movies based on books that I've liked. I'm like, wow, if I put the book and the movie together, I've got a whole other thing here that somehow transcends both of them. And you kind of hope for that in the end.
And it's been a few years since like the original story came out, so
Right.
I think you modernized it. I mean, did you take certain things maybe from the real world, inspirations from the real world, maybe for
Well,
this?
yeah, there are little touches here and there where you can see that we're reacting to what's happening right now. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Not all men. Um, which is one of my favorite lines in there when Superman does try to use that line on Wonder Woman. Which actually opens up a very interesting. See, when the first time I read Red Sun, and this was a long time ago, I felt that Superman comes off as much more sympathetic in the original book
Interesting.
than. Yeah, I really feel that, and it's not to say that you don't make a sympathetic Superman and you don't make a Superman that is, twisted by the own dark world he's born into. Which between this and speeding bullets, definitely is something that I think you're very good at. Looking at the darkness that can come from a Superman in a darker world, in a world without Ma and Pa Kent, as it were. Um, you know, okay, you can talk a little bit later, buddy. Um, uh, and and although I really felt that we get much more of the darkness in Superman in this, in the frustration and anger he feels that he's not winning the argument, or that not everyone agrees with his argument because he's right. That just because he sees the world the way it should be doesn't doesn't ring true for everyone.
Right.
And
One of the things. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, please.
One of
Cut
the
me
things
off if you ever
that I
need to.
think is interesting is that depending on how you look at the story, Superman is the hero of the story, or Luthor is the hero of the story, or Superman is the villain of the story, or Luthor is the villain of the story. They're both, they both do things that are morally questionable, and yet I think the thing about this Superman is he is fighting for his Soviet version of truth, justice, and the American way. One of the things early in the story, without giving too much away, when he discovers, and this I think this is something that we brought in the adaptation, when he discovers the truth behind Stalin's beautiful communist vision and what's really going on with the gulags, he's completely demolished by that because he really has a very pure, idealistic vision of what this could be. He really wants a world in his head where everything is fair and everyone is taken care of. And that's always the problem. And I don't remember whether I think it's even addressed in dialogue, or I get mixed up sometimes between other stories I've written with similar themes, where it's like, can you impose order from without, or does that have to be something that comes from within people,
Yes.
no matter how pure your ideals and how good your intentions, And so that was the fun thing with him. And maybe it got a little darker because I think we addressed the underbelly of the Soviet Union a little more directly than they did in the graphic novel.
Yeah.
It was really important to put in those scenes with the gulags because that's what was going on. We created obviously our own version of that.
Yeah.
So that when he returns back to Stalin, it's a very different thing that happens than happens in the original version. And you can understand why he responded that way.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate where we see the process, and we see, and for what it's worth, it gives him a much more human continence, or countenance. I don't know how to pronounce that word.
As long as he's not incontinent, we're fine.
Yes, where he is making the hard choices, and when we see the entire thing with the and I don't know how spoiler we agreed to get to on this.
Go ahead.
Okay. When we get
Mildly spoilery.
Okay, yeah. So warning, spoilers. And actually it is in the books as well.
If
When
it's
we
in the
get
books,
to
don't worry about it.
Yeah, when we get to the overriding of people's free will who were dissenters, it creates just this reality that, you know, in this context, it's, well, I'm not as bad as Stalin was, but still we can see where the problem is.
Right.
One of the other changes you make in this is, of course, we make a Batman who is, as I was talking to my son about this, who, by the way, he loves your Batman in this.
Oh yeah.
Yes, where he's a bit more Jokerish, where he is an element of chaos.
Yeah, very
You
much
know,
so. He wants to
and
bring the system down, and he'll do it any way he can.
exactly, and I really like that. Although it's dark to watch and difficult to watch, but then when we compare it to that idea of that complete loss of free will, it you start to understand where everyone's coming from in this much more difficult way, you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it is just it's a very beautifully told tale in this. Um, and what I think, and for the record, you do address it in dialogue in the film. And again, one of the things I really appreciate is the idea at the end when the Soviet Union is falling, and it comes to this idea of, and actually it's before this, before the total end, but the idea that rule by one man, can't be a utopia, even
Right.
if everyone is cared for. A benevolent king, no matter how benevolent he is still a king, and your rights are still only limited by what the king allows. And that, I think, is, in our modern political dialogue, there's a lot of discussion of, democratic socialism versus democratic capitalism. um, and I think what the central point is that so long as you have that democratic voice, that is what keeps it, even though having that democratic voice is chaotic and difficult and can lead to problematic moments in history. The democratic voice is what sets us right, not the imposition of someone else's will above that democracy. And I think, like I said, in these very strange political times we live in, uh, it's a really interesting message, and maybe even a kind of you know shocking message to a lot of people who maybe are getting more and more into the idea that, well, maybe democracy is the problem. And I think addressing it as, no, actually democracy will always be the solution, or
Right. Well,
hopefully.
when you look at what's going on around the world, let's go to pre-coronavirus world.
Hmm.
Where there is authoritarianism on the upswing all
Hmm.
over the world, and it's a scary thing. And not that any of us were consciously thinking about it, at least I wasn't when we were writing the story, because once you get into the story, you're just following the story and the characters, and then the themes sort of emerge as you go along. But I'm always much more following it from the characters out than from the plot in. But what you're saying is absolutely right, and that is what the story is about in a lot of ways, and that's Superman's journey. When he gets to the end and he realizes that no matter how noble his intentions, and he has made the world a better place. That's the weird thing. In a lot of ways, he really has. Poverty, hunger, all these things have been reduced. In some ways, people's lives are better. Well, so some of them have implants in their brains, so they'll behave. But people aren't hungry anymore. And there's all
Yeah.
these trade-offs, and he has to come to the realization that as just as what you're saying, as messy as it is, people have to chart their own destiny.
And along those lines, he made Luthor a better person, arguably. He's
Yes.
still the driven megalomaniac he is, but at the same time, now, because he wants to win the argument too, in that sense of these two supermen facing off against each other, it is about winning the argument more than just defeating the guy. It's, no, I need to win the argument. And it's brilliant that after he's won the argument, he's done, and he and he walks away,
And
because
I
it's like, yeah.
and I think, speaking of Luthor, I think you wrote a more sympathetic Luthor than actually was in the actual comic. In the comic, he's just like, "Oh, Lois, we have to put our marriage on hiatus. I have to solve this. I have to beat this guy." I mean, again, he's he forgets her half the time in the movie, but he just seems more like, "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I love you." He seems more sympathetic here.
Right. There's the scene, which we won't get into the details, with Superior Man, where
Yes.
he and she gets really, really, really upset with him, and you see that it matters to him what she thinks. It
Hmm.
really matters. But what you're saying is really true about he's not thinking about democracy either. He's thinking about just what you're saying. This guy is a challenge. It's a chess game to him, and he wants to win. And if in the end we have a more democratic world, but that's the icing on the cake to him. He wants to play a game with this alien Superman and win. That's really what
Yes.
it's about for him. And maybe Lois is sort of his Jiminy Cricket in a way. She's his conscience, and she keeps him a little more tethered in humanity.
Yeah. And again, that is one of the things that I think it really communicates in this. And we have a very different ending from what we get in the book, and I think in many ways it's an improvement, because when you try to go too far out in any story, it's either too little information or too much information, and it can take away from the greaterness of the story. And having it end where it does, with arguably ostensibly a happy ending, but at the same time, is any ending truly happy?
Right.
Call no man happy who is not dead, as they say.
Orson Welles said, "Happy ending depends on where you stop your story."
Exactly.
But the difference, I think the ending in the comic is fantastic, but I think at the end of this streamlined movie, it would have been just too much, and I think that's why we decided to not include that. It would have thrown the balance off of what we did. It works really, really well, and it's a really wonderful concept, which I don't want to give away in case anyone hasn't read it, that Mark does at the end of the comic. And when I say we, I have to really underscore that this story, I worked with Bruce Timm and Jim Krieg, who were the producers on this, and we would get on the phone for hours and like peel this story apart and put it back together. And I'd go off and write. Then they'd see my draft, and we'd get on the phone for hours. So it was the three of us putting the story together. And then, of course, Sam, the director, just takes it and brings it to beautiful visual life, adding wonderful little touches through the animation. So the whole thing is a group effort. It's really a group effort. So I cannot take all the credit, nor could I take all the blame if you didn't like it. It's all of us together.
Lilith, do you have anything?
No, you boys are doing good. Don't worry about it.
So yeah, it is just a great film. Now, as I said, you also wrote Speeding Bullets.
Yes.
Which is again a very interesting take on Superman, taking Superman in your own way. It's a different Superman in a different universe, and how the things he witnesses, the darkness he experiences, kind of alters his direction as a hero, and it mirrors the Batman story. And I won't get into the details there, but of course it also mirrors the Superman story and makes a brilliant blending of the two, I think. It is interesting how in those moments of darkness that it does leave you with that, as the saying goes, for the want of a nail, the entire story changes and we get something different. But then again, of course, Superman does fight his way back in the end to that idea of truth, justice, and peace for all mankind in his own way.
Right, and I think that's the thing about these stories and these I quote iconic characters. I know it's an overused word, but with Superman, I think it's appropriate. You can bend them and twist them in all sorts of ways, but there is a fundamental something about Superman, even in Red Son. By the end, even his misdeeds in Red Son are coming from that fundamental Superman place of wanting to make life better for people. And by the end, what he comes to, you could argue that by the end he might go off and be the Superman that we know in some way. Maybe he's doing it quietly behind the scenes now. And the same thing with Speeding Bullets. It's like, yeah, all this stuff is it's sort of like all of us. I think we all come into life with a basic nature, and our childhoods, our dysfunction, our pain, the traumas that we go through can layer on top of that nature. But I think if you're lucky enough to peel that away in your life, the fundamental nature will always shine through. Some people get so twisted by life's events and life's traumas that maybe that fundamental nature gets lost forever. But I think for most of us, we can find a way to get back to that fundamental nature of who we are. And I think that's certainly true for Superman. I think I was talking about the fact that someone asked me about, did you ever do any other Elseworld stories? And I pitched a couple right after I did Red Son, one of which was sort of a reverse, where Bruce Wayne is kidnapped by an alien probe and brought to Krypton in remember that cold vision of Krypton in the John Byrne era? And he's raised by this completely heartless Jor-El, and he grows up to hate the system. So he calls himself Superman to mock them, and basically becomes an agent of chaos to bring down the Kryptonian hierarchy. That was one of them. But the other one was, and I understand why they didn't go for this one, but the idea was the rocket lands and it gets found by this white supremacist family. So he's essentially raised to be like a super Klansman, right? But the whole journey would be, they twist him so much, but of course there's a fundamental nature in there of Superman And there's always got to be the lowest there, or somebody that brings that out in him, so that in the end he brings down the very people that raised him, and becomes the Superman that we know. So no matter how far you twist him, even to that extreme, I believe that he will always be Superman in the end. You'd have to twist him so far and so long for that to be lost. And really, as a culture, we don't want that to ever be lost.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Honestly, that's a perfect time to repitch that story.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I would love to see you right out of that hole, quite frankly, because that does sound like a really deep hole to dig out of. But I would imagine you could do it and do it quite well.
Well, you hear these amazing stories about people that were brought up that way, and then something happens, and someone reaches out to them with an act of compassion, and they suddenly begin to see the world in a different way, and they leave that life behind, And I'm always touched and amazed by stories like that. There's a story I heard years ago, and the guy was a neo-Nazi, and this neo-Nazi group was harassing this one rabbi for whatever reason. I don't remember the details. And then this guy, he has some terrible accident, and he's like in a wheelchair, and his friends abandon him. And the guy that comes along to take care of him is the rabbi that he was harassing, and brings him into his home. And this totally transforms this guy's life and his view of humanity and who we are. So that kind of journey is it's amazing, obviously, in life, and we want to reflect that in fiction, because I believe in the redemption journey for all of us. I really do. So it would be a challenge to tell that story, and I think one of the reasons DC didn't want to do it, and it makes perfect sense, is what's your cover image? Now, that's not a good image. That's not a good image at all. A guy maybe in a Klan suit with an S sprayed on his chest. So maybe no matter, maybe it would work more in a novel where you don't have the visuals that people can pull out and do things with. But so I understood that rejection. The Batman story, I never quite got why they rejected that one, because I think that would be the Superman on Krypton thing. I think that would be a really cool story. Yeah. Anyway, we're getting sidetracked.
Well, with Superman, I mean, in any Superman story, is that like the beginning of it all? It's like you have to figure out how much comes from what he was taught, who raised him, and then it's like he has to have at least a little bit of innate goodness in him, and you have to find like the right mix.
Yeah, I think so. Because I don't think a Superman story would work where he lost that innate goodness, where he's just super evil. I don't. Maybe that's just me. Someone else might make that work. That's not the Superman story I want to tell, or particularly want to read, where he could be ultimately corrupted.
Yeah. So no Crime Syndicate of America stories.
Right. Well, those work fine because we still have our Superman in our dimension. So it's okay to play off against each other.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, and I was trying to look into it. Have you ever done any what ifs for Marvel?
I never did any what ifs. Never did. I thought about that recently. That for some reason I never worked on that book. It's funny because I just it was supposed to come out this month, but because of everything with Diamond and everything, it shifted. But I just did a Star Trek story for IDW, which is they're doing a whole series of Mirror Universe stories, and I did the original series Mirror Universe story, which is a retelling of the original Space Seed Khan story. Ooh. And I realized working on it, Mirror Universe, it's an Elseworlds, really, is what it is, because you get to play with the iconic characters that but you put them in a different context, and you bend them and you
give them a goatee.
Exactly, right. Give them a goatee and wait and see if you can make their essential nature come out in some way. So I had a great time working on that story, and I have no idea, really. I think it might be coming out in May, we hope. It all depends on where the world is by May, I guess. But I realize that's an Elseworld. Those Mirror Universe stories are Elseworld stories, essentially, and what if stories.
The reason why that jumped out at me, among everything else in the conversation, is when I'm watching Red Sun, it really strikes me how much Lex Luthor is a Reed Richards character in this. In the fact that he does seem very stuck in his own mind, stuck by the challenge facing him, and but at the same time, and now granted, I don't think Reed Richards would create a superior man to go and die, but at the same time, I can't necessarily write it out of the situation either, because again, from his perspective, it's like, no, it wasn't a human. It was never really sentient. It was a
Right.
construct I made, you know, and, it's responding to stimuli. It's not really, it's, like in a lot of stories we're reading right now with AIs, sort of just being seen as disposable people, and what
Right.
going into the Star Trek universe, what they sort of if you're looking at Picard, Nick, what the AIs became in Star Trek before they got rid of them. Spoilers for Picard. Um, just seeing this idea of disposable people, and what would you do if you had beings that didn't mind being disposable?
Right. Are the justifications that anyone makes, whether it's the justifications we make in our everyday lives or the justifications science makes? Well, I'm going to make an atomic bomb because we need to end this war. And yes, it'll be the most devastating weapon in the history of humankind, but I have my reasons why we need to drop this bomb. It's the same thing. How far do the justifications go? And it's an eternal human issue.
I mean, Charlie brought up the what ifs. I was just thinking. I love your classic run on Captain America. I would love to talk to you about that someday in depth. But
Sure.
do you think would a story like this work with Steve Rogers, like a what if? Would you be interested in that?
So meaning like a Red Sunish kind of story?
Yeah, kind of like Steve Rogers, in World War
Well, there are
II.
a lot of similarities, between those two guys
Yeah,
because I look at Steve Rogers certainly as the truly good, decent. That's his nature. He's a good and decent and compassionate man. And so, if you took that good, decent, compassionate man and he was a Soviet super soldier, it might be a very similar story, with yeah, but then why do it? Because it's essentially redoing Red Sun.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but yeah, but there, if there's a parallel, I think in the Marvel universe to Superman, it's certainly Steve Rogers. In
I
terms
mean,
of this, they would be, I think they would be really good friends, or maybe they'd be so much alike they just annoy the hell out of each other.
Yes, well, the whole superpower differential would always be an issue, kind of like
Right.
I think it is for Batman and Superman. Um,
well, I could see this.
I guess Cap
Yeah.
in a way is kind of a mixture of the two because Cap is the guy who isn't that superpowered and yet somehow has the ability to kick ass everywhere he goes, no matter how strong his opponent is, just like Batman. So I guess Cap
exactly.
is the ultimate fusion of Superman and Batman in some ways, without
Yeah.
Batman's darkness.
I think that
Yes.
would be the big difference in the Steve Rogers Red Sun story is like people would underestimate him because he
Yes.
isn't a superpower. He
Yes,
isn't this
absolutely.
big god level power yet.
Yeah.
Right.
All you gotta do is have Erskine defect to the Soviet Union instead of the United States, and there you
That's
go.
right. That's
Then
right.
it's the Red Guardian story,
That's right.
and yeah, which would be interesting as well. But yeah, there's a lot of great stories to tell in these, and definitely appreciate the work you've done on this. It
It
really,
was a fun and challenging project because the source material was so rich. If you really look through that book, you can really on every page there's like interesting concepts that almost in some ways it reminds me of like reading Jack Kirby stories when he's writing his own stuff, and Kirby would have some mind blowing concept on page 2, and then page 3 on to the next mind blowing concept. And so this
it's
the Red Sun is filled with these wonderful ideas, and so the challenge was, what do we use? What do we not use? What do we leave out? What do we streamline? Because it's such rich source material that Mark gave us to work with.
okay. Let me ask you this, because this is something I was trying to go back and rewatch the scenes to see if I could see a clue for this. Did Lex Luthor send Brainiac to the Soviet Union, or is the Brainiac just going to the Soviet Union because that's where Superman is?
No, Lex sent him.
Lex did send him, so
Yeah.
okay. So I couldn't quite figure that out, and
Okay.
it definitely it's set up to look like that. That's certainly what happens in the book, but I wasn't
Right.
quite certain of that.
Right, because I even think he says something to Lois at the end about, or to someone that he was, it doesn't matter that well, we don't want to, what happens to Superior Man happens, because he's using him just to test Superman's limits and things like
Yeah.
that. So he wanted that confrontation.
Well, yeah, and I understood that. That part I understood. It was just whether or not that particular scene
I see.
was
I see.
was because not for nothing, aliens are still going to be invading.
Right.
It's not like that's always one of those things I think that sometimes gets overlooked whenever you're trying to tell a different story, is that there's still a whole cosmos out there with aliens and dark sides and all these beings that are going to be attacking the Earth at some point or another. Although arguably maybe with Superman and people being more focused on Superman, maybe going out into space wasn't as big of a deal for humans, so we don't draw as much attention to ourselves.
Wait, so were you talking about Superior Man or Brainiac? Because he said
Brainiac.
Superior Man. Oh,
Did I say?
I think you said Superior Man. That's also, I just gave you the answer to the wrong question.
Yes, it was Brainiac, the great Brainiac.
Oh, yeah. That's an interesting question. I think that's one of those questions that don't need an answer, that you can come up with your own answer, because you can tilt your head one way and look at the story and say that Brainiac is just something that just popped in. And the other is that he was in, Lex was somehow manipulating that as well. Right. Yeah. So that now it makes more sense, because I was answering about Superior Man. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's pretty explicit that yes.
Yeah, that's why I was a little baffled by the question. So it's okay.
That's okay. I don't always say the right words.
You can cut this whole sequence out, right?
Yeah. We'll make you sound much better, and we'll make you sound much worse. I promise.
Okay.
But I also like your take. I mean, both are good, but in the comic, it seems like a lot of it is just like other people's perspective of Superman. Here, it's like more of like the first person. You're like from Superman's point of view.
Yeah. You're in it more directly with him, perhaps. Yeah.
And
yeah, did like that.
Yes. Definitely, I think making Superman be the proactive seizer of power in the Soviet Union helps the story as well. It just it makes it, it explains all of his other actions as it goes forward, and I think that is what is necessary for this story, especially, as you say, telling it in an abbreviated timeline. One of the things I always feel about adaptations is that you have to, and you said it yourself, you're keeping true to the spirit, but you also have to tell the story in a new way, so that it's not just the exact beats of the comic, because then there's no surprise. And leaving Brainiac open to interpretation certainly is that kind of question that will leave nerds debating it for years to come.
And it's not like you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to make this different just to make it different. It's just you follow the story, and that's the joy of writing for me in general. Once you're into the story, you're not dictating to the story is dictating to you. The characters are leading you on, the plot is leading you on, and then it leads you to surprising places. And the favorite thing that happens for me as a writer is when my own story rears up and surprises me. When I'm writing and I go, I didn't know that, I didn't expect that to happen. And that's the beauty of the journey with the story. It really does take on a life of its own, and delights and surprises me. And with that moment when you go, I can't believe that happened. I didn't expect that. So I'm thinking, if I didn't expect it, then I know the readers aren't going to expect it, which is always a great moment.
Now, here's a question for you. Now, you among the many iconic characters you worked on over the years, one is, of course, Conan, who is his own version of a Superman, kind of a Captain America, Batman kind of character in his own light as well. Now that he's back at Marvel, now that he's being integrated into the modern Marvel universe, do you have any thoughts or ideas of what you might want to see happen with Conan?
It's interesting. And the Conan thing is really interesting for me, because that was my first regular gig at Marvel. And go back in time to that period, Roy Thomas had been the only person writing Conan for 10 years. And here I am, brand new, still really learning my craft. And they're like, here, you're going to replace Roy Thomas on Conan. It may have been the single most intimidating gig of my entire career. And I look back and I can see all the warts and flaws. They're collecting. Actually, it's coming out in a big omnibus a few months down the line, my entire run on Conan. And I loved Conan, especially the when Barry Smith was on the book. But I loved it all. But the Smith-Thomas Conan, whew, that was just phenomenal stuff. And of course, I read all the RE8 stuff and loved it when I was a teenager and a young adult. But it was really intimidating. It was really. I remember the first issue. I was sitting there like trying to channel Roy Thomas and his style, and I finally had to kind of relax. It took a few issues to relax into it and feel a little bit more like myself. And So I've sometimes wondered if I could go back now and approach that character again with the skill that I've developed over the ensuing decades and see what I don't have a clear image in my mind of what I would do. Um, but it would be an interesting thing. One of the things I love about Conan is not so much the I'm a barbarian with a sword who's going to lop your head off, but it's the mystery of that world, the magic of that world. You really feel like you're walking through another time, another dimension. Through his prose, Howard really created that, and I always said that I think in a lot of ways John Buscema drew the better Conan, and Thomas created the better Hyborian Age. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
The world, Conan's world, was brought to this just magical, mystical life. I would love to have seen John Buscema's Conan walking through Barry Smith's world. It would have been a really interesting thing. But that's the part that always really engaged me more than anything. Although, when you're a teenager, there's a lot to be said with, kicking in doors and lopping off heads and stuff. It helps the hormones while they're popping. But it's really the world. It's Conan's world and that magic and that mystery, and that's why story like Tower of the Elephant. I just have always loved that story because of the magic and the mystery. Frost Giant's daughter. That's not about the violence. It's about the magic of it. And that'd be now that I'm thinking about it. Now that we're all locked down, it'd be fun to go. I haven't read those stories in years. Not my stories. I mean the actual Howard stories.
Yeah.
I've reread the comics over the years. To go back and reread Howard stuff, that would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be interesting, I think, and to do something very poetic and very magical, and yet still true to the character, and do it now. Yeah, it would be kind of fun, I think.
Yeah. Well, and so based on that, I think it seems like you'd rather write him in the Hyborian Age than, because right now we have the two, we actually, as maybe but they have the entire expanded Hyborian Age universe that Marvel is creating,
I guess
and
I
then
don't know. I'm not really up on it, so tell me what's going
oh
on.
yeah, so big Conan fan. So yeah, yeah. So we do have an entire Hyborian Age universe with like two other characters at least who are also in Conan's universe, but not Conan. Balit and Valeria, and then you also have Conan currently time displaced into the modern Marvel Comics universe. And then you also have a bunch of other Howard characters running around the Marvel universe now as well. Apparently,
In the
apparently
Marvel, in the contemporary Marvel universe?
not the well, sort of in a creating much in the same way that back in the day the Hyborian Age was part of the Marvel Comics canonical history. Now the
Right.
entire Howard canon is in Marvel history. So
I see.
Disney and Marvel is very much double downing on the rights they have currently acquired with Conan, which
But
makes
Conan
me
is
excited.
also a character in the modern Marvel universe now?
Yes, and in the original Hyborian Age. So
I see.
he's got two books in the Hyborian Age, and I think currently, if you count the spinoff of the Serpent Crown saga that he's currently running through, which of course is also on hiatus right now, he's in that and Savage Avengers. So yeah, he's got multiple stories going on in the modern Marvel universe, classic Conan in the Hyborian Age, and then other Hyborian Age characters, and then other Howard characters, whose names are jumping out of my head right now, but I'm forgetting.
Are they using Cull and Solomon Kane and all those guys?
Yeah, Solomon Kane and oh, there was a female character as well, and I'm blanking on her name. But yes, but Solomon Kane, they just had him in a whole crossover storyline with Moon Knight. So Solomon and Kane and Moon Knight were
Oh
hanging out.
God,
Yeah.
Don't
I
say
can't
Moon
wrap
Knight
my
too
head
many
around.
times. He'll slip and play.
Yes.
Hey, this man here wrote a Moon Knight arc.
Yes. So that
Although I'm the
they
guy
kind
that
of
when I wrote Marvel Team Up, I had a Spider-Man King Cull team up, so I can't, you know what I mean? I can't look askance at what they're doing.
well, honestly, I like that, and I like that entire idea of there were several what ifs with
Right.
Conan in the modern age, one where he goes back almost immediately and one where he's kind of stuck in the modern age and fights Captain America, and that one actually happens to be one of my favorite what ifs. So
Wow,
um
Conan versus Captain America. I don't remember that story. That's funny.
yeah, it was really good. It was really good. sort of the Captain America even gives a nice speech at the end about, in a world without freedom and justice, might that not be the shape of a hero? So,
Not that you remember it or anything.
it's a little ingrained in my head. So
Yeah,
so
that's great.
big Conan fan. That was like one of the first comics that I got as a kid in subscription form. So
And did that lead you to the Howard stories? Did you go then and read all the original stuff?
I'll be honest with you, no, I have not. It's a
You
big.
haven't read the original Howard
I haven't read the
stories?
original Howard stuff. I honestly, for a long time in my youth, I wasn't even aware that Conan existed
Wow.
outside of movies and comic books.
What's
I'm a bad
interesting?
nerd.
Wow. Well, you should try it. Go get a collection of Howard stuff and really see where this came from. Because we're talking about adaptations and source material, right? Go back to the source material. Really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff. You know what? Since I was around, I was a teenager when the original Conan book came out. So what I think a lot of people that may be reading Conan now don't realize was how different that book was when it first appeared. It's funny that we're now down a whole Conan road here, but that's fine. In that, the whole 60s was about the superhero revolution and the Marvel superheroes. So suddenly this book comes along, with this, and the first ads with this guy in this helmet with horns in it, and in like a loincloth and a sword. What is this? There had not, in my experience, I had never seen anything like it. And it made my 16-year-old brain explode, and I read the comics, and I had to run out and buy the paperbacks, and I completely got lost really deeply in Conan land for quite a while when I was a teenager. I still remember a friend of mine. I turned him on to the Conan stuff, and he showed up at my house one day, I guess in a very Conan kind of mood, and instead of knocking on the door, he kicks the door really, really hard. But he didn't realize my father was home, and my father opened the door with his eyes on fire. It's like poor guy's trying to be Conan, and then he suddenly shrank into a little ball. But yeah, those comics were like revolutionary in their day when they first came out, because there had never been anything like that. And then you watch Barry Smith evolve as an artist, and there had never been art like that in a comic book. It was just extraordinary.
Well, I will definitely be picking up the Howard books after this interview. I've got time, so
Yeah, it's one thing we all have right now is a little bit of time here.
That's probably one bright side. People can discover new things like, literature, comics.
Yeah, because it is, on the one hand, there's all this horrible stuff going on. On the other hand, it is allowing us to slow down a little bit. It's allowing us to see what's important and not important in our lives, and I hope it's expanding people's hearts a little bit too. And it's letting the environment breathe. And I wanted to go look this up to see about just global acts of violence. There has to be. It has to be a more peaceful world right now. It just has to be, because so many countries are locked down. So it's a fascinating contrast, of what's going on right now. It's really the stories that are going to come out of this when this is all over is going to be really interesting.
I thought I heard somewhere they said the death rate in Chicago had actually, by violence, had actually gone down.
Oh yeah, it has to. It has to. It's really interesting. And I'm thinking about like war zones and things. It's really is like the earth is saying, hey guys, back off. Reevaluate your priorities here a little bit. It's a strange and interesting times we're living in.
All right. Since we're off the beaten path here, the whole thing, the whole mess with the comic industry right now, it's basically kind of shut down. I read that some comic creators were talking about, we need to revitalize the whole thing after everything comes back is a new Marvel versus DC or Marvel team up DC crossover, whatever. One, would you be interested in doing anything for that? And two, who would be your dream team up?
Well, I got to do my dream team up twice. I did for Marvel. I did a Spider-Man and Batman, and then DC asked me to do Batman, Spider-Man. So that was to do one of them was phenomenal. To do both of them, one for each company, was just great. And each story had a little bit of a different tone and different artist, and it was just so that almost was the whole dream come true right there. But we're to have this conversation just now about Superman and Captain America. That might be kind of a fun, interesting team up, wouldn't it? Yeah. To do the two of them, or I really, really love the supernatural characters. the DC universe especially has just such a deep bench of amazing supernatural characters. I loved writing the Justice League Dark comic. I loved writing Dr. Fate and Spectre. I loved writing the Constantine animated movie. I love that world. So to take, Constantine and Doctor Strange, something like that. Now there's a cool team up, and talk about different personalities that you could contrast. Yeah, so that would be fun to play, and then to use each of those characters so you can bring in all the different supernatural elements of both universes. That maybe that's the team up I'd want to do more than any other. That would be really fun, really fun.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think they could actually pull this off? Because I don't know, it just seems like Marvel and DC don't want to play these days.
I mean, they used to do it all the time, and it was, nobody was, everyone got along, everyone played well. So if they want to do it, they certainly should be able to do it. This idea, since I was always a freelancer, there were even times when I had an exclusive contract with Marvel, but I had a clause in my contract that allowed me to do Vertigo work, creator-owned work for Vertigo, and I basically always went back and forth between both companies. I never understood this Marvel versus DC thing. Maybe that's in the head of some executive somewhere or some fan somewhere. But most of us as freelancers, we're just people that love comics and love the universes of not just both those companies, but anybody that'll give us work for that matter. But, so going back and forth between the two, playing in both universes, that's natural for me. I've always done it. So this idea that, they can never come together and do this because they're rivals, that's nonsense to me. If they want to do it, they could do it. Plus, I think, it would be a sales bonanza if they started doing that stuff again. And after this is over, they're going to need some sales bonanzas, because it's going to be rocky for a little while.
My pitch, which they're always free to steal, I think they should get together to save the Amalgam universe.
Yes.
So you mean three universes?
Three universes, yes.
Wow.
Well, Amalgam was the universe that got created out of their last crossover. So
I see.
Yeah,
I think you need Grant Morrison for that one. You need a mind like that, because I think I would get overwhelmed having to crash through all three universes.
Okay.
Lil, if anything.
You boys are doing good. I'm proud of you. It's fine.
We're always looking for Lilith's approval. She's very important to us.
All right. Charlie, but if you don't have anything else, I was going to say we can let Mr. Dematteis do his plugs.
Yes. What are you up to, Mr. Dematteis?
Well, I'm working on a couple of comic book projects that I couldn't talk about anyway because they haven't been announced, and B, now because of what's going on, everything's kind of on hold. I did just start work on another animated movie for Warner Brothers, another DC-related animated movie, which I can't tell you about. There's that Star Trek story I mentioned, but that I think maybe will be out in May. It's hard to do plugs right now, and everything is sort of in flux. So I guess the things to plug would be things that are out there right now. Obviously, we've talked about Superman Red Sun. If you want some free entertainment, download the CW Seed app. I did there's a Deathstroke animated series on CW Seed.
Yes.
The first batch of episodes is out. What usually happens with these Seed stories is I write a full-length animated movie. They break it up into these episodes. They put a batch of episodes on Seed, and the first half, and then somewhere down the line they release the full-length movie, which has 20 more minutes than you'll see on Seed. Then they release the rest of the shortened episodes on Seed later on. But you can go on CW Seed right now for free and see. It's about 35 minutes worth of Deathstroke. It's another project that really came out really, really well. I'm really happy with. And right now we're all looking for something to watch. So I think people will enjoy that. And then I'll plug a few collected editions. They've been out for a while, but they're important projects to me. I did a series for Karen Berger at Berger Books called The Girl in the Bay. There's a collected edition of that out now. If you're a fan of my Vertigo work, it's a very sort of Vertigo-esque, twisty, supernatural, time travel, identity story. And it was so much fun to work with Karen. And I hadn't worked together in years, and she's one of my dearest friends. So it was really great to work with her again on this project. Then at the other end of the spectrum, I did a project for IDW with my buddy Mike Cavallero called Impossible Incorporated, which is a big sort of Fantastic Four meets Doctor Who meets Doc Savage about this teenage girl genius going on cosmic adventures, through parallel universes and time and everything else. There's a certain genre, that whole sort of Fantastic Four / Doctor Who genre, because those two things kind of meet in the middle because it's all about imagination and you can go anywhere. So this was a chance to really do that kind of story with a bunch of original characters. And Mike just did such a beautiful job on the art. So that's out there too. And the final thing I'll plug is Dark Horse did a beautiful, beautiful hardcover collection of Moonshadow, which is, if I was going to pick the 2 or 3 best things I've ever done in my career, Moonshadow is one of them. And this is Moonshadow, the definitive edition. It's got the original 12